For 3,000 years, the Vorath Empire had conquered every star system they encountered, and their warships cut through space like knives through water, and their weapons reduced planets to ash, and their warriors knew no defeat. The Vorath were apex predators given form and technology, and they stood 8 feet tall with armor that grew naturally from their bodies and 4 arms that could tear through steel as easily as paper tears. The galaxy had learned to bow before them because resistance meant death, and submission meant survival, even if that survival came with chains. The peaceful Minari had surrendered their entire civilization within a week because they valued life over freedom. The warrior clans of Brekor had fought for 2 years before their last stronghold fell, and their warriors died with weapons in their hands, but they still died. The crystalline Shara were beings of pure energy and logic, and they had calculated the futility of resistance and submitted immediately because mathematics told them fighting was pointless. Even the ancient Kellys, whose civilization spanned back 10,000 years, had bent the knee rather than face extinction because they believed that a subjugated culture could survive while an extinct one could not. Commander Zethrak stood on the bridge of the warship Endless. Darkness and his primary arms were folded across his armored chest, while his secondary arms manipulated the holographic display before him. His vertical pupils narrowed as he studied the star charts of the newest sector, designated for conquest, and he felt the familiar satisfaction that came with each new campaign. His subordinate Krellick approached with the preliminary survey data, and his mandibles clicked with what passed for amusement among their kind. The data showed a primitive species that called themselves humans, and they had barely begun exploring their own star system. Their weapons were chemical-based projectiles and simple nuclear devices, and their ships could not even exceed light speed. They were confined to a single planet they called Earth, with approximately 8 billion individuals, and a few thousand scattered across small colonies on nearby celestial bodies. Zethrak studied the information with the casual interest of a predator observing prey, and he asked how many warships would be needed for this conquest. Krellick suggested 3 ships would be more than sufficient, because these humans had no technology that could threaten even a single Vorath vessel. The commander agreed, and gave the order to deploy the standard conquest fleet because this would be over before the next solar cycle. The Vorath had perfected the art of subjugation over 3 millennia, and their strategy never varied because it never needed to vary. They would arrive in overwhelming force and demonstrate superior firepower, and broadcast the demand for immediate surrender, and when the inevitable resistance came, they would crush it without mercy. Within days or sometimes hours, the new species would understand their place in the galactic order and would submit to Vorath rule. The conquest fleet entered Earth's solar system 3 weeks later, and 3 massive warships, each 2 kilometers long and bristling with weapons that could level continents, moved through space like harbingers of doom. They passed Jupiter without slowing and ignored the small human research station that orbited the gas giant. That station sent frantic transmissions that the Vorath did not bother to intercept, because the words of primitives held no interest. When the fleet reached Earth's moon, Zethrak activated the universal translator and broadcast to every device on the planet below. His voice carried across every radio frequency and appeared on every screen and echoed through every speaker on Earth. The message was simple and had been delivered to hundreds of species before, and it never changed because it never needed to change. Zethrak identified himself as commander of the Vorath Empire and informed the humans that their planet had been selected for incorporation into the Empire. He gave them 1 planetary rotation to surrender unconditionally, and explained they would dismantle all military forces and submit to Vorath governance and provide tribute as determined by their economic councils. He told them that resistance was futile, and defiance meant extinction, and he advised them to choose wisely. The transmission ended, and Zethrak settled into his command throne to wait for the inevitable groveling response that would come on Earth. Emergency sessions were called in. Every major government and the United Nations building in New York filled beyond capacity. Military commanders reviewed their arsenals with growing horror, and scientists ran calculations that confirmed what everyone already knew. Humanity possessed no weapons that could threaten ships of such size and obvious technological superiority. In the United States Space Force headquarters, General Richard Hayes stood before a wall of monitors showing the 3 alien warships, and his jaw was set, and his gray eyes were hard. Beside him, Admiral Patricia Morgan studied tactical readouts with the calm of someone who had spent 40 years in military service, and she understood what the data meant. Patricia said quietly that their missiles could not touch the Vorath at that range, and even if they launched everything they had, the enemy point defense systems would intercept long before impact. Richard replied that he knew this, but surrender was not an option either, because they had seen what happened to other species. The Vorath stripped worlds bare and turned entire civilizations into slaves and resource extraction operations. Patricia asked what they should do, and Richard said they would buy time and make the Vorath think they were considering their terms. Meanwhile, they would evacuate as many people as possible to underground facilities and scatter their command structure and prepare for asymmetric warfare. Patricia gestured at the displays and asked how they could fight against ships that could destroy their entire planet from orbit. Richard's expression was grim, and he said they would make sure that taking Earth cost the Vorath more than they had ever paid before, and they would pray someone figured out a weakness they could exploit. On the warship Endless Darkness, Zethric waited, and the human response came exactly 12 hours after his initial broadcast. A single human appeared on the communication screen, and he was an older male wearing ceremonial dress, and he identified himself as Secretary General Carlos Mendez of the United Nations. He requested a diplomatic meeting to discuss terms and said they needed time to coordinate a response among their various nations. Zethrac's mandibles clicked with satisfaction, because this was the same tired pattern and it always meant the same thing. The primitives were stalling and hoping and praying for a miracle that would never come. He told them they had 6 additional planetary rotations and then bombardment would commence. He ordered them to choose a meeting location and transmit coordinates. The transmission ended, and Krelik approached the command throne and observed that the humans would use this time to prepare defenses. Zethrak told him to let them prepare because it made no difference. Their weapons could not harm Vorath ships and their vessels could not escape, and in 6 days they would surrender or die. The pattern had held for 3,000 years across hundreds of conquered worlds and dozens of subjugated species, and it would hold now. But Commander Zethrak did not know humans, and he did not know their history of defiance against impossible odds. He did not know about warriors who held mountain passes against armies or cities that refused to fall, even when surrounded, or countless battles where humans chose death over submission. He did not know that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or their physical prowess, but their absolute refusal to accept the unacceptable. The Vorath had made many species afraid across the galaxy, and they believed fear led to surrender. But they were about to learn that humans responded to fear differently than any species they had ever encountered, and angry humans were the most dangerous force the universe had ever created. The meeting was scheduled to take place on the International Space Station, and it was humanity's modest orbital facility that circled Earth every 90 minutes. Secretary General Carlos Mendez floated in the conference module, and he was flanked by representatives from every major Earth nation. General Richard Hayes was present along with Admiral Patricia Morgan and Dr. Helen Kim, who was humanity's leading xenobiologist despite having never encountered an actual alien before this week. The Vorath shuttle approached the space station like a predator approaching prey, and it was sleek and menacing even in its simple transport function. When Commander Zethrak and 2 of his warriors entered through the airlock, the humans got their first close look at their would-be conquerors, and the sight made several representatives step back. Involuntarily, the Vorath were terrifying up close, and their chitinous armor gleamed under the station's lights, and their forearms moved with disturbing coordination, and their eyes held the cold calculation of creatures who had never known defeat. When Zethrak spoke, his voice came through the translator as a deep rumble that seemed to resonate in human bones. He asked if the humans had prepared their surrender, and his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Carlos Mendez maintained his diplomatic composure despite the fear that gripped his chest, and he said they wished to understand the terms more fully. He asked what exactly incorporation into the Vorath Empire would entail, and his voice remained steady even though his hands trembled slightly. Zethrak's facial plates shifted in what might have been amusement, and he explained that humans would dismantle all weapons and provide raw materials and labor as directed. Their most intelligent individuals would serve in technical capacities, and resistance or failure to meet quotas would result in culling. He said these were the same terms offered to all species, and his tone suggested this was generous. General Richard Hayes asked what would happen if they refused, and his voice carried a challenge that made the other human representatives tense. Zethrak manipulated a device on his forearm, and a holographic display appeared showing a planet. He said this was the homeworld of the Jalvik, and they had chosen defiance. The hologram showed Vorath, warships firing upon the planet, and massive energy beams struck the surface, creating explosions that bloomed across entire continents. The oceans boiled and the atmosphere ignited, and within minutes the planet was a scorched, lifeless rock. Zethrak said without emotion that they had killed all 6 billion Jalvik in 4 planetary rotations. Their civilization had existed for 8,000 years, and it took the Vorath 4 days to erase all evidence they ever existed. He said this was the cost of refusal, and his tone suggested he felt no remorse for the genocide. The humans in the conference module were silent, and Dr. Helen Kim's hands trembled and Admiral Patricia Morgan's jaw clenched. But General Richard Hayes leaned forward, and his gray eyes locked on Zethrak's alien features, and he said he had a question about Vorath military doctrine. Zethrak's head tilted slightly in what might have been curiosity, and he told the general to speak. Richard asked if the Vorath had ever encountered a species that fought back effectively even for a short time. He wanted to know if any species had actually hurt them or destroyed their ships or killed significant numbers of their warriors. The question seemed to puzzle the Vorath commander, and he said all species fought back initially and all were crushed, because the pattern was universal. Richard pressed further and asked specifically if any species had caused real damage before their defeat. Zethrak's mandibles clicked in what the translator interpreted as contemptuous laughter, and he said the Brekor warrior clans had destroyed 2 scout vessels before their defeat. In 3,000 years of conquest, the Vorath had lost perhaps a dozen ships to all conflicts combined. He said Richard's question revealed his desperation and that humans searched for hope where none existed. Richard Hayes smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression, and he said, actually, his question was to confirm something he suspected. He told Zethrak that the Vorath had grown complacent and forgotten how to fight an enemy that truly wanted to hurt them. Zethrak rose from his seated position, and his bulk made the conference module seem suddenly cramped. He started to speak, but Richard interrupted and said he dared because the Vorath had made a critical mistake. They had assumed humans were like every other species they had encountered, and assumed fear would make them submit, but they did not understand humanity at all. Zethrak said he would educate the humans about their place, and his warriors moved forward threateningly. Carlos Mendez held up a hand and pleaded for calm and said General Hayes spoke from emotion, and they were here to negotiate. But Richard was not finished, and he told Zethrak that showing them what happened to the Jalvik was meant to terrify them into submission. Instead, it taught them exactly what they were fighting for, and had just guaranteed that humanity would never surrender. Zethrak stated flatly that humanity would die then, and his tone suggested this was inevitable. Richard conceded that maybe humanity would die, but said they would take as many Vorath with them as possible. He said that was what Zethrak did not understand about humans, because they were not logical like the Shara, and not peaceful like the Minari. Humans were a species that evolved fighting each other for thousands of years, and they had committed genocides against themselves. They had built weapons capable of destroying their own planet dozens of times over, and they knew how to hate and they knew how to kill. The conference module fell silent, and the other human representatives looked at Richard with shock and understanding. He had just declared war against an enemy that could exterminate humanity, but he had also voiced what many of them were thinking. Zethrak stared at the human general for a long moment and said he was either the bravest or most foolish creature the commander had encountered. He said he had not decided which, and perhaps the general was both. Richard told him to be clear then, and he formally rejected the Vorath terms. He said humanity would not surrender and would not submit, and if the Vorath wanted Earth, they should come down and take it from them. Zethrak's laugh was like grinding stone, and he said as the humans wished. He told them they had sealed their species' fate, and bombardment would begin in 2 planetary rotations. He suggested they use this time to make peace with whatever gods they worshipped. Zethrak and his warriors departed the space station, and the shuttle returned to the warship Endless Darkness. Within the conference module, the human representatives erupted in argument, and the Chinese representative shouted at Richard that he had doomed them all. Richard replied quietly that they were doomed anyway, and at least now they would die on their feet. Admiral Patricia Morgan moved beside him and said the Vorath would start bombing population centers, and billions would die. Richard said he knew, but if they surrendered, billions would die anyway, just more slowly. At least this way they controlled their own fate. Dr. Helen Kim was crying softly, but she nodded and asked what they would do now. Richard looked out the viewport at the distant Earth below, and it was so blue and beautiful and fragile. He said now they would show the Vorath why every human culture across all of history had stories about the underdog, who refused to quit. They would show them that humanity did not go quietly into extinction, and that angry humans were the most dangerous thing the universe had ever seen. The bombardment began exactly as promised, and the Vorath warship Endless Darkness moved into position above North America and charged its primary weapons. Down on Earth, air raid sirens wailed across Washington, as millions of people rushed toward underground shelters that everyone knew would be inadequate against weapons that could crack continents. Commander Zethrak watched the targeting display with cold satisfaction, and he ordered his crew to begin with the human capital and let them watch their leadership evaporate. The massive energy cannon on the Endless Darkness glowed with building power, and operators made final adjustments and the firing sequence initiated. Then, something impossible happened, and a spread of missiles erupted from hidden silos across the American Midwest. They were not heading toward space, but arcing toward predetermined points in the upper atmosphere, and they detonated simultaneously at precise altitudes. The electromagnetic pulses they generated were not directed at the Vorath ships, but at very specific points in Earth's magnetosphere. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic, because the carefully balanced magnetic fields that protected Earth from solar radiation were disrupted, and they fluctuated wildly. The Vorath sensors were calibrated for normal stellar conditions, and they suddenly found themselves dealing with electromagnetic chaos that made precise targeting impossible. The energy beam from the Endless Darkness fired, and it missed Washington by 40 kilometers and instead vaporized a section of the Atlantic Ocean and sent a massive tsunami racing toward the coast. On the bridge, Zethrak roared in fury and demanded to know what happened, and ordered his crew to recalibrate sensors. An operator reported that the planet's magnetic field was destabilizing, and they could not get a clean targeting lock. Zethrak ordered them to fire anyway and saturate the area with weapons fire. But before the second shot could be fired, another wave of missiles launched from different locations, and these were different from the first wave. The new missiles were crude by Vorath standards, but effective, and they were loaded with thousands of small metal fragments and basic explosives designed to create clouds of debris in low Earth orbit. The debris spread rapidly and created an expanding field of projectiles moving at orbital velocity. The Vorath point defense systems tracked and destroyed most of them, but there were thousands, and some got through. Small pieces of metal traveling at tremendous speed slammed into the hull of the Endless Darkness, and most bounced off harmlessly, but a few struck sensor arrays and communication nodes and delicate external equipment. An operator reported minor damage to external systems and said nothing was critical. Zethrak's mandibles clicked in annoyance rather than concern, and he ordered them to continue bombardment, and said these were the desperate acts of a dying species. In the Pentagon's backup command center buried deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, General Richard Hayes watched the tactical displays with grim satisfaction. Admiral Patricia Morgan reported that the debris screen was working, and they were degrading Vorath targeting capability and sensor accuracy. Richard said it would not stop them, but it would slow them down and buy humanity time. He asked how many people got into shelters before that first shot, and Patricia said approximately 60% of Washington's population. The tsunami would cause casualties along the coast, but evacuations were already in progress. Richard nodded, and his expression was heavy, because they had known civilian casualties were inevitable. The goal was survival of the species, not preservation of every life, and it was a brutal calculus, but war always was. Richard ordered Phase 2 and said to launch the Spartans. Around the globe, hidden facilities opened, and from underground silos and disguised warehouses and military bases, a new generation of spacecraft launched toward orbit. These were not exploration vessels or satellites, but fighters built in secret over the past 6 days since the Vorath arrived. They were constructed using every bit of human engineering ingenuity and desperation. The Spartan fighters were crude compared to Vorath technology, and they used chemical rockets for thrust, and their armor was basic titanium alloys. Their weapons were nothing more than high-velocity railguns and modified nuclear warheads, but they had one advantage. They were piloted by humans who had nothing left to lose. Captain Jake Morrison sat in the cramped cockpit of Spartan 1 as it rocketed toward the nearest Vorath warship, and his fighter was one of 30 in the first wave. He knew the mission was essentially a suicide run, but he had volunteered anyway because his wife and daughter were in San Francisco. If Earth burned, they would burn, and at least this way he could fight back. Jake spoke into his radio and told all Spartans to remember their training. He said they were not trying to destroy these ships, but trying to hurt them and make them bleed and show them that humans were not prey. 29 other pilots acknowledged his words, and all of them were equally determined. The Vorath point defense systems tracked the incoming fighters and began firing. Energy beams lanced through space, and Spartan 7 exploded in a ball of fire. Spartan 12 took a glancing hit and spiraled away, trailing atmosphere, but the others pressed on, and they used evasive maneuvers in the debris field to break targeting locks. On the endless darkness, alarms began blaring, and an operator reported multiple small craft incoming with primitive designs, but numerous. Zethrak ordered them destroyed dismissively, but the humans had learned from 6 days of frantic analysis and study. They had observed how the Vorath point defense systems tracked targets and noted the patterns of their fire and calculated blind spots in their coverage. The Spartan pilots exploited every weakness, and they dove through the defense grid like birds through a net. Spartan 3 took a direct hit and disintegrated, and Spartan 8's engine failed. The pilot detonated his nuclear payload, hoping to damage the enemy ship with his death. But 6 Spartans made it through to firing range. Jake Morrison locked his railgun on a section of the Vorath hull that appeared to have communication antennas. He told all remaining Spartans to fire, and the railguns were simple weapons. They were electromagnetically accelerated slugs of tungsten, traveling at a significant fraction of light speed. Against the massive armor of a Vorath warship, they should have been ineffective, but the humans had learned about kinetic energy. Mass times velocity squared meant even a small projectile, moving fast enough, carried tremendous destructive force. The tungsten slug slammed into the hull of the endless darkness, and the armor held, but the impact created stress fractures. More importantly, the slugs destroyed 3 sensor clusters and 2 communication arrays. Then the Spartans detonated their nuclear payloads, and the warheads were not powerful enough to destroy a ship designed to survive orbital bombardment, but they were powerful enough to create electromagnetic pulses that fried external systems and heat and radiation that damaged delicate sensors and shock waves that rattled the hull. Inside the endless darkness, lights flickered and systems crashed and rebooted. Commander Zethrak was thrown from his command throne as the ship shuddered, and he roared, demanding a damage report. An operator said multiple systems were offline, and external sensors were damaged and communications were degraded. There were no hull breaches, but they had lost 40% of their point defense capability. Zethrak stared at the displays showing the wreckage of the human fighters, and all 30 had been destroyed. But they had hurt him, and actually hurt him. In 3,000 years of conquest, no species had damaged a Vorath warship so quickly. Zethrak demanded to know how this was possible, and said these humans were primitives. His second officer, Krellick, studied the tactical analysis and said they were primitive, yes, but tactically sophisticated. They used the debris field and exploited sensor blind spots and coordinated their attack with precision. And most concerning was that they did not hesitate, and not one of them attempted to retreat or survive. They came only to damage the Vorath, knowing they would die. Zethrak said this was fanaticism and desperation, but Krellick said slowly that perhaps the human general was correct. Perhaps the Vorath did not understand humans at all. 3 months after the first engagement, the war had become a nightmare that neither side had anticipated. The Vorath had expected a swift conquest, and the humans had expected annihilation, but instead both sides found themselves locked in a grinding conflict that defied all predictions. Commander Zethrak stood in the war room of the endless darkness, studying holographic displays that showed a planet he no longer recognized. Earth's surface was scarred by bombardment craters, and its cities lay in ruins, and massive firestorms raged across continents. The Vorath had killed an estimated 3 billion humans in those first months, but humanity had not surrendered. Zethrak ordered a report, and his voice carried an edge that had not been there at the war's beginning. Krellick manipulated the display and said human resistance had actually intensified. They had retreated into underground facilities the Vorath did not know existed, and their ground forces had sustained 37% casualties attempting to root them out. 37% was a staggering number because in the conquest of the Brekor warrior clans, the Vorath had lost less than 5% of their ground troops across 2 years of fighting. Against these primitive humans, they had lost more in 3 months. Krellick continued and said the humans were using tactics the Vorath had never encountered. Ambush and sabotage and suicide attacks were constant threats. They hid among civilian populations and used their own wounded as bait to lure Vorath warriors into traps. They fought without honor or restraint. Zethrak said quietly that there was no honor in war and only victory or defeat mattered. He said he had taught the humans that lesson and perhaps he had taught them too well. The display shifted to show footage from a ground engagement in what had once been New York City. Vorath warriors advanced through rubble-strewn streets and each warrior was a formidable killing machine. Then the ambush came and humans emerged from sewers and collapsed buildings and from beneath debris. They attacked with crude weapons and explosives strapped to their bodies and determination that bordered on madness. The Vorath warriors killed dozens of humans, but more kept coming. When the engagement ended, 6 Vorath lay dead with their armor pierced by sustained gunfire and their bodies broken by explosives. The surviving humans melted back into the ruins and dragged their own dead with them, leaving no trace. Krellick observed that humans never left their dead behind and said the Vorath did not understand why. A new voice spoke, and it was the ship's science officer, Thelnis, entering the war room. He said every body the Vorath captured was information denied, because the humans prevented them from studying their physiology and weaknesses. They were learning to fight the Vorath. Zethrak's mandibles clicked in frustration, and he asked why they could not break the humans when they had orbital superiority and technological superiority. Thelnis said the humans did not fight like any species the Vorath had encountered. They accepted losses the Vorath would consider catastrophic, and they sacrificed themselves without hesitation. Most concerning was that they were adapting faster than the Vorath could adjust their tactics. The display changed to show the ruins of 3 Vorath landing sites. Thelnis said these were staging areas for ground forces, and humans attacked all 3 simultaneously using stolen Vorath weapons they had somehow learned to operate. They killed 200 warriors and destroyed significant equipment before the Vorath could respond. On Earth, in a bunker complex beneath the Canadian Rockies, General Richard Hayes was conducting his own assessment of the war, and the news was grim. Admiral Patricia Morgan reported current estimated human population at 4.2 billion, down from 8 billion before the war. They were losing approximately 30 million per month to bombardment and disease and starvation. Richard absorbed the numbers without visible emotion, though inside he felt each death like a knife. He asked about military capabilities, and Patricia said they had exhausted 90% of their pre-war stockpiles. They were manufacturing weapons and ammunition using whatever facilities survived, but it was not enough. They were increasingly reliant on captured Vorath technology. Colonel Lisa Grant commanded guerrilla operations in former Asia, and she interjected that her teams had figured out how to operate Vorath basic weapons. They even managed to get one of their transport vehicles working. Richard asked how they accomplished this, and Lisa's smile was grim. She said trial and error, and mostly error. It cost them 15 people figuring out the controls, but now they could teach others. Dr. Helen Kim entered the command center carrying data pads filled with analysis. She said she had completed the physiological study of Vorath corpses they recovered, and she had good news and bad news. Richard said bad news first, and Helen explained that Vorath were tougher than humans in almost every way. Stronger and more resilient with better sensory capabilities. In a straight fight, 1 Vorath warrior could kill 5 trained human soldiers. Richard asked about the good news, and Helen's expression was predatory. She said they had weaknesses because the joints between their armor plates were vulnerable. Their visual spectrum was different from humans, which meant human infrared signatures confused their targeting. Most importantly, they were not used to fighting an enemy that refused to quit, and it was making them careless. Richard nodded slowly and said they were teaching the Vorath to fear humans. Helen said more than that, because they were teaching them to hate. She had analyzed Vorath communication patterns when they thought humans were not listening. They were calling humans vermin and parasites and things that needed to be exterminated. They had stopped thinking of this as conquest, and now it was personal. Richard said flatly that this was good because angry enemies made mistakes. A junior officer approached with an urgent message and said they were receiving reports from the European resistance. They had successfully ambushed a Vorath supply convoy and captured significant weapons and equipment. Richard asked about casualties, and the officer said 43 humans were killed, but they took out 20 Vorath and secured enough weapons to arm 200 resistance fighters. Richard did the mathematics automatically, and 43 humans for 20 Vorath and weapons that would enable more fighting meant, in the brutal calculus of this war, it was a victory. He hated that he thought that way now, but survival required it. The officer continued nervously and said there was something else. The resistance leader who coordinated the ambush recorded a message, and she asked them to broadcast it on all channels, including Vorath frequencies. Richard said to show him, and the display activated, showing a young woman with a dirt-streaked face and exhausted eyes. She stood amid the wreckage of Vorath vehicles holding one of their weapons. When she spoke, her voice was steady despite her obvious fatigue. She said her name was Kate Murphy, and she was a teacher before the war. She taught history to high school students in Dublin, and today she led an attack that killed 20 Vorath warriors. She was broadcasting this so they understood something important. They came to Earth expecting to find prey, but instead they found humans. Every teacher and every farmer and every person they killed made them weaker, because humans all learned how to hurt them. They were not soldiers, but the Vorath were teaching them to be, and humans were good students. Kate paused and looked directly at the camera. She told the Vorath they had already lost, because even if they killed all humans, they had lost. They came here thinking they were invincible, and humans had proven they were not. Every ship damaged and every warrior killed and every day spent fighting humans was a day not conquering someone else. Humans were costing them time and resources, and soldiers and humanity would never ever stop. The message ended and the command center was silent. Admiral Patricia Morgan said quietly that Kate was right, because they could not win this war in any conventional sense, but they could make the Vorath lose. Richard nodded and ordered them to broadcast that message on every frequency. He wanted every human to see it, and every Vorath to see it, because they needed to understand what they were fighting. 6 months into the war, Earth was dying, and the planet's atmosphere was choked with ash from continent-spanning fires. The oceans were poisoned by industrial chemicals released in the fighting, and 3/4 of humanity was dead. The survivors were scattered across underground bunkers and fortified caves, living like their ancient ancestors. The Vorath had paid a terrible price as well, because of the 30 ships eventually committed to Earth's conquest. 8 had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair. More than 30,000 Vorath warriors lay dead on Earth's surface, and their bodies were burned by humans who refused to let the enemy study what they had killed. Commander Zethrak had aged in those 6 months, and his chitinous armor showed cracks and scars from multiple assassination attempts. He stood now in the command center of a temporary ground facility, protected by triple layers of security, after humans had somehow infiltrated and destroyed 2 previous installations. Krellick reported that the Council had issued an ultimatum, and his voice carried a weight of defeat that would have been unthinkable at the war's beginning. They were ordered to conclude this campaign within 1 lunar cycle or withdraw. Zethrak's voice was barely above a whisper when he asked about withdrawal after all they had sacrificed. Krellick said the Council feared the example they were setting, because already 3 subjugated species had attempted rebellion inspired by human resistance. The Minari, who surrendered within a week of the Vorath arrival at their world, had now launched an uprising. They were using tactics they learned from intercepted human broadcasts. Zethrak laughed, and it was a bitter sound. He said the humans won even if the Vorath killed them all, because their defiance had become a plague spreading through the Empire. Thelnis entered the command center and said there might be another option. The science officer looked exhausted, and he said he had been analyzing human psychology and culture. He believed he understood why they fought so fiercely. Zethrak told him to explain, and Thelnis said humans fought because they had hope. Not hope of victory, but hope of meaning. Every human who died fighting believed their death served a purpose to slow the Vorath and hurt them and inspire others. Remove that hope and resistance would crumble. Zethrak asked how they could remove hope from a species that fought on even as their planet burned. Thelnis manipulated a display showing a small blue-green world on the edge of human-explored space. He said this was Mars, and the human colony there contained approximately 10,000 individuals, mostly scientists and their families. They were completely undefended and focused on terraforming research. If the Vorath threatened to destroy that colony unless Earth surrendered within 1 planetary rotation, they would give humans a choice: their own lives or the future of their species. Zethrak considered this and asked if Thelnis thought humans would surrender to save 10,000. Thelnis said no, but it would force them to confront the ultimate cost of their resistance. If they did not surrender, the Vorath would destroy Mars and prove that human defiance had consequences beyond Earth. Either way, they would break something inside the humans. The message was broadcast 12 hours later, and instead of Zethrak's voice, it was simple text across every frequency. Humans of Earth had one planetary rotation to surrender unconditionally, and if they refused, the Vorath would destroy the Mars colony and all 10,000 residents. They were told to choose. In the command bunker beneath what had once been Vancouver, General Richard Hayes read the message and felt something inside him break. For 6 months, he had ordered people to their deaths and made choices that haunted him every waking moment. He had watched humanity die by inches, but this was different. Admiral Patricia Morgan said quietly that the Vorath knew Mars was undefended, and they knew humans could not protect it. Colonel Lisa Grant said it was a bluff, because the Vorath wanted humans to surrender before their council forced them to withdraw. Dr. Helen Kim said it was not a bluff, because she had intercepted Vorath communications and analyzed them obsessively. They were desperate and they would do it. Richard Hayes sat in silence for a long time, and around him the command staff waited. Finally he spoke and said to get him a connection to Mars. He said to set up a broadcast to all human survivors, because they needed to have a conversation. 20 minutes later, Richard faced a camera knowing his words would reach millions of humans hiding in bunkers across a dying planet. He wore his uniform, but it was scorched and torn from fighting. His gray eyes were red from exhaustion and smoke. He said his name was General Richard Hayes, and 6 months ago he stood before the Vorath and told them humanity would never surrender. Today they had given humans a choice between their lives and the future of their species. They threatened to destroy the colony on Mars unless humans submitted. He paused and his voice grew stronger. He said he could not make this choice alone, because every human who survived had earned the right to decide their own fate. He was asking if they should surrender to save 10,000 lives on Mars or continue fighting even at that terrible cost. The responses came quickly through cobbled together communication networks and from bunkers across the planet. Humanity spoke. Richard watched the messages flood in, and his heart grew heavier with each one. From a shelter beneath Sydney came the message to keep fighting because they had lost too many to quit now. From a cave system in the former Himalayan mountains came no surrender, because the Vorath would kill them eventually anyway. From a bunker in Brazil where 300 humans barely survived came the message to fight on. If Mars surrendered, then everyone would surrender later, and it was better to die free. The pattern held across all regions and all nations and all the remnants of human civilization. The vote was nearly unanimous for no surrender. But then a different message came through, and it was from Mars itself. A woman's face appeared on the screen, and she was young and scared but resolute. She said this was Colony Director Amy Parker, and the people of Mars had voted. They knew what happened if Earth surrendered because it meant extinction just slower. They would not buy their survival with humanity's freedom. They had loaded all their research data onto drone ships and launched them into deep space. If they died, their knowledge survived. She told the Vorath no surrender and told Earth that Mars was proud to be human. Richard Hayes closed his eyes and made the hardest decision of his life. When he opened them again, he activated the broadcast to the Vorath. He said this was Richard Hayes, and Earth's answer was no. They would not surrender to save Mars or to save themselves. If the Vorath wanted this planet, they should come down and take it one bunker at a time, and one human at a time. Each human would cost them blood. The transmission ended, and Richard sat in his command chair, an old man who had sent 10,000 people to their deaths to preserve a principle. Around him, the command staff was silent. Admiral Patricia Morgan said softly that he made the right choice. Richard's voice was hollow when he asked if he did because he'd just killed 10,000 people. Dr. Helen Kim said he gave them meaning and let them matter. That was what they were fighting for, and the right to matter. On the endless darkness, Commander Zethrak received Earth's defiance and felt something he had not experienced in his long military career. He felt respect for his enemy. Krellick said in disbelief that humans chose to let their colony die and condemned 10,000 of their own rather than surrender. Zethrak said quietly that they understood what he learned too late. This war was not about territory or resources, but about whether a species had the right to choose its own fate. They had answered with blood. Krellick asked if they should proceed with the execution. Zethrak was silent for a long time, and then he made a decision that would change history. He said no, and they would withdraw from Earth. The command center erupted in shock, and officers said the council had ordered them to conclude this campaign. Zethrak said he was concluding it because they would withdraw all forces from Earth's surface. They would establish a blockade but cease bombardment. An officer said the humans would not surrender just because they stopped bombing them. Zethrak said he knew, but this war had taught him something. Some species could not be conquered, and they could only be destroyed. Destruction was never their purpose because the Vorath Empire was built on subjugation and forcing other species to serve them. But what was the point of an empire built on subjects who would never stop rebelling? Zethrak turned from the display showing Earth's ruins and said they would withdraw. They would let humans have their poisoned, burning planet. They had won nothing but the right to die slowly among their ruins, but they had won something. That was more than any species had achieved against the Vorath in 3,000 years. The order went out, and across Earth Vorath forces began withdrawing to their ships. Humans watched in confusion and disbelief as their enemies retreated with no final bombardment and no last great assault, just withdrawal. In the Vancouver bunker, General Richard Hayes received the reports with numbness and asked if it was over. Admiral Patricia Morgan confirmed they were leaving Earth's orbit and maintaining a distant blockade, but all ground forces were evacuating. Richard asked if they won, and Patricia corrected him. She said they survived, and she was not sure that was the same thing. Richard walked through the